I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
All right, folks. This week, it's not going to be a downer, but it is going to be serious. There's no way around this. One of the reoccurring themes on our show, I think in the past 6 months or so is, well, probably, I guess, a year. More like a year, I guess. Is that we've been kind of checking in every now and again on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. We'll probably use that acronym about 1,000 times in this show. So just to be upfront, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I get it wrong about 90% of the time. Don't do what I do. Anyways, we've been following along with what's going on there, and there's some recent developments in that story we want to talk about. But there's also some other environmentally related news coming down from SCOTUS that I think is important. So we're going to kind of talk about those two things together because if you think about it, and if you can do this good Marxist analysis like we do, you can kind of see how these two things are actually connected in a really integral way and a real doomer kind of way too. So hold on to your butts, as we say on the show, and get ready for what should be, I think, illuminating content. In the last few weeks, there have been a number of important decisions handed down by the Supreme Court of the United States. You know them. You've been here right along with us for most of them, I'm sure. There's a lot going on with this big, ugly rogue court that we got going on. And I don't know, a lot happening there for sure. Other people are covering that content. Tune in to Know Your Enemy if you want to hear more about all of the recent SCOTUS decisions. They've been doing a lot of good stuff with that. Anyways, one SCOTUS decision that I think is important, but it's kind of just gone under the radar, is in a case called West Virginia versus the EPA. So in this case, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, again, if you don't know all the acronyms, it's all right. The Supreme Court said that the EPA doesn't have the same power to regulate the emissions of power plants. It's more sort of limited than previously exercised. And that's kind of an interesting thing to happen in light of awful climate change. That's not what you want to hear people say at this point, I think, in our horrible hellscape. So we're going to talk about the specifics of that decision in a minute. But we're also going to talk about the larger narrative around the international environmental guidance from the UN. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change I've been talking about. So recently there was a section of that report, section 6 of that report, that was leaked that is pretty interesting. So basically the story here is there's a section of this report that was leaked and it didn't make it into the final version. And it's really important. The section was about sort of like guidance for policymakers about the impossibility of unlimited growth in the world and how that's just, not feasible. Anyways, that got cut for some interesting reasons that I think Dean will talk about in a minute. But I think these two things together kind of demonstrate or reveal that there's sort of a big capitalist feedback loop about climate change that simply serves to reinforce the assumptions of capitalism at this point, right? The government is saying the EPA can't do, these actually pretty modest regulations to power plant emissions. And then, we're states or were the federal government to look for guidance on how to actually tackle climate change, they would look to, the IPCC report, which is also going to tell them things about, about capitalism and how it's, not a fundamental problem or something. So all these things are kind of working together and they create this awful loop that really that creates a difficulty within our government to like actually address climate change in a real way. That doesn't just kind of like reinforce the assumptions of capitalism. So I think in light of this, we're going to think through some of the ways that the recent Supreme Court decision and the news about the leaked IPCC report reveal some conspiratorial thinking or some very diluted thinking that will inevitably, get us all killed in the end and make the planet unlivable. So on that note, Dean, let's talk about the EPA. Did you hear about the story up in the Great White North of Canada?
Yeah, it did make its way up to these airwaves up here. In a pretty muted way. As you said, there's been a lot going on in SCOTUS and more generally in the United States. Lots of bad stuff, and those things tend to catch on, I guess, more in Canada. The decisions around abortion, the shooting, all that kind of stuff. So I guess I haven't heard a lot of people in Canada talking about the EPA in particular. But it's interesting, too, because, Canada is a weird country in that it's always kind of proximal to the U.S., right? Like, it's comparing itself with the United States all the time. And I think that also means a lot of people, I guess, sort of expect the worst out of the U.S. and then also take that opportunity to pat themselves in the back in Canada. So when it comes to things like, if you did hear someone talk about the EPA decision, my assumption is I've never heard anyone talk about this, so take it with a grain of salt, I guess. This is my hypothetical Canadian who's talking to me about the EPA. My assumption is that, most Canadians, the average Canadian that I sort of chat with would say something like, have you heard about this very, very awful thing? And as you got talking about it, they would usually end kind of saying that Canada has its problems, but we're grateful to live in a country that like takes this stuff seriously, inevitably kind of, I guess, blanketing over all the ways in which Canada doesn't. So it's a standard Canadian trope. But all that to say, yes, it's made its way here, but it has not electrified the discourse. We'll put it that way in Canada.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, in the United States, it was, a news item for a minute and then it kind of fell to the wayside. And I'm sure it'll come back up again because there are some pretty vast implications that this ruling could have for other governmental organizations as well. But, whatever. It'll come up again and you'll hear about it. But this podcast, hopefully, will tell you about it first. Also, I was going to say, too, that why should Canada care about the EPA? But when it comes to climate change, they're going to have to care sooner or later. But
yeah. Also,
yikes.
This is kind of an aside, but it matters, too, because, as you may know, the environment does not know that there are borders between the United States and Canada. And it is actually a huge problem for reasons that I guess we'll get into. But I've always lived around the Great Lakes, right? Like I grew up in Michigan. I live in Ontario. And the Great Lakes have often been a huge sticking point between the U.S. and Canada, especially when it comes to environmental stuff. What one country does affects the other one pretty directly. And that's true of all kinds of other environmental issues across the border in particular. So even though climate change, of course, is a kind of meta issue, these kinds of things affect Canada actually very directly in some other weird ways. So I'm sure there's some Canada policy nerds who are worried about it, but I don't know them.
They should be worried about it. Good for those nerds. Like I said, if you didn't know about it or you're not super familiar with what's going on, I'll just tell you right now. Listen to me, a trusted, not expert on a podcast. So the Supreme Court decision specifically focuses on a section of the Clean Air Act, which is a piece of legislation that was passed a long time ago in the 1970s. Super long time ago, before I was born. How great. However, during the Obama administration, the EPA used the Clean Air Act as a basis for what was called the Clean Power Plan. These great, great catchy titles from the Obama administration. Anyways, the Clean Power Plan sets sort of these national standards for carbon emissions for power plants, which is a great forward-thinking piece of policy, which basically adds up to cap and trade types of policies. Which, if you know anything about cap and trade, they're not the thing that's going to save us from climate change, but they're also, I don't know, not nothing. However, the Clean Power Plan policies, they were repealed by the Trump administration and they were never put back into place by Joe Biden. Thanks, Joe. So anyways, what's this all got to do with SCOTUS, you might be asking? And that's a good question. That's what I'm asking too. It means that SCOTUS is basically going to go around the EPA, and the ruling that they made last week basically disempowers the EPA from making future rules about power plant emissions. This is incredibly boring stuff, but this is kind of what climate policy is really all about. It's a huge deal because power plants are responsible for a huge chunk of U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions. I looked around a few different places, and it seems like most people think that it's about 32% of the U.S. energy-related CO2 emissions is from power plants. So a pretty big chunk. And I gotta say, I'd love it if that was capped and traded and pushed way down. Within that 32%, though, coal plants specifically are responsible for 59% of those emissions. So it's like a pretty big chunk of carbon emissions that we're talking about here that now the EPA can't regulate in the same way or as much. So it's bad. It's bleak. And coming from West Virginia, you can imagine that there's a lot of coal folks involved.
Mm-hmm.
So overall, this whole thing basically stops the EPA from implementing, like I said, cap and trade policies, which, I mean, if you've read any literature on climate change, that's like the sort of like green capitalist answer to everything is cap and trade. Basically, what it means is that companies can buy pollution credits from other companies and pollute more. So it's kind of like a pretty weak policy. But I guess what you have to think is that even if those extremely liberal reforms can't happen, you're definitely not going to get half Earth socialism or degrowth, or you're not going to get even the Green New Deal, right? So if you can't even get the most sort of weak and mild reforms to happen, there's definitely not going to be anything more radical than that. Disempowering the EPA is a bad idea, I gotta say. There's a lot of other things going on there too. Some people have suggested that this might also disempower other federal organizations like the FDA. So I don't want that to happen either. I think it's bad. In a lot of ways, this is it's a rogue Supreme Court gone even roguer. It's just trying to disempower the federal government basically to do anything, which I'm not a fan of the federal government. I think that it's bad in a lot of ways, but the things I do like about it, like governmental agencies that regulate things I eat or how much coal plants can emit carbon, I think those things are good. So there you go. So there's a lot to consider with all of this. Clearly, the Supreme Court is kind of off the rails. And when I say kind of, I mean a lot. But a lot of people have gotten caught up in the particular way that the Supreme Court sucks. And I think that's fine. And the Supreme Court isn't great, I got to say, to put it mildly. But I think a lot of people have missed also the international scope of this decision. Like we were talking about a minute ago, whether people in Canada care or not about the EPA, this will be a problem for them as well. It will be a huge problem for people in the global south as well. Because, climate change hurts the global south more than people in the north, just to put it very bluntly. It will always hurt the poorest amongst us, and that's bad. So this huge thing with the EPA going on, I think, is extremely bad and dreary and kind of notes a certain nihilism, I think, amongst the ruling class in the U.S., but it's all pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot of legal mumbo jumbo that is all very interesting or frustrating or whatever it might be, right? So if the EPA doesn't get to choose or regulate who emits what and how much, then who does? And I guess, I don't know, the state governments. Well, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of legal mumbo jumbo around that. I'm once again not an expert, but the way this works is basically or at least as I understand it, is that all of these federal governmental organizations, they are empowered by Congress. So if the governmental organizations themselves are not able to have the agency to kind of just act in and of themselves like the EPA has done in the past, it means that they have to come as mandates from Congress, and they kind of get caught up in the Supreme Court in all kinds of other ways too. So it's just it's disempowering the agencies in favor of empowering Congress. But y'all have seen Congress. You don't need me to tell you how bad it is. There's all kinds of political stalemates, there's all kinds of problems there too. So it's it's disempowering one organization and kind of putting more power in the hands of others. But the problem is that the EPA knows how to make environmental policies, whereas Congress is beholden to their class interests and to their corporate donors. So not much hope on that front.
Yeah, well, congratulations to Joe Manchin, specifically a big coal guy in Congress. The reason I ask that, I think, is the question always becomes who regulates and how and why. And as you just said, Matt, Congress in particular is beholden to these class interests. And I think that is why I've also found the conversation around the IPCC report most recently really illuminating. I don't know if we want to move to that right away or if you want to sort of pause on the EPA or kind of throw it all in a big soup at the end. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I believe in making your podcast as much like a soup as possible. So let's
Okay.
just kind of push it all together.
All right, a couple cooks in this kitchen. So the IPCC report connects with this in some really interesting ways because the United Nations, they have all kinds of commissions, all kinds of reports that they put out, and the efficacy of these reports is, I think, a subject of constant debate, right? Like everybody's supposed to kind of care about what the United Nations has to say, and people spend all kinds of time and resources. Governments, nations spend lots of time and resources trying to make documents, make decisions, all this kind of stuff at that level that are supposed to be important. They're supposed to be things people listen to and so on. That doesn't always happen, and the United Nations is definitely not always good either. But, nevertheless, it's a very interesting kind of place where nations do talk to each other in this kind of bizarre organization. So one of those big reports is this report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the report has been kind of being released over time. It's very big. It's like a multi-year research project and so on. And the idea here is that it's a report produced by the scientific community, not the political community, with the interest of informing, political decisions at the UN and elsewhere. So when we talk about something like the EPA empowering Congress, it's like, let's say you're a lawmaker or a policy nerd or something like that, and you wanted to think about climate change. I guess the hope of the UN is like you would care what the UN has to say about it, since the US is a member nation, one with quite a lot of power, right? So these things are supposed to be in dialogue. Again, they're often not. But nevertheless, let's say, you went to the UN for guidance, what would you find? So the IPCC has been releasing this report, and back in 2021, they released a scientific report that had to do with policy. It was called the Summary for Policymakers, or the SPM. And the full report that's been released so far, what we have from the IPCC, is actually kind of intense. I'm sure you've seen the headlines. Like Matt said, we've talked about it on the show a handful of times in the past. It paints a pretty bleak picture of our present, and not to mention our future. And so the policy piece, I guess, is an important kind of question. What are we supposed to do about this bleak future? And the summary for policymakers that was released is actually pretty tepid or kind of cowardly. And there was some question as to why. And the actual report written by the scientists was leaked, and it turned out that it had been edited really heavily, super redacted by a number of governments in the process of getting it out as part of the official report. So our favorite socialist publication, the Monthly Review, they've been writing all kinds of stuff about the IPCC. You can do a big search on their website, find a lot of great content. But there was a good editorial in the issue last month in June that really lays out kind of exactly what was changed. And we can talk about some of the specifics in a minute. But the short of it is that, surprise, the changes are made in a way that is kind of de-radicalizing and also explicitly in the interest of the wealthy class. So just to give you a little bit of an intro paragraph here. They say the final report was published following alterations by the governments of the SPM in April 2022. Yet the final governmental drafted SPM, the only part of the climate change that is read widely and affects policy, negated almost all of what scientists themselves had previously agreed on with respect to mitigation of climate change in their original draft of the SPM, creating a sharp divergence between this and the rest of the 2,900-page report. Right, so what the Monthly Review is saying is like, look, nobody reads 2,900 pages of anything. What they're going to read is the implications for policy, and guess what? It got hijacked at the end, and here's how. So bad news coming out of the IPCC. That's the short of it.
That is the short of it. It is bad news. In case you need a quick refresher, I think at this point, now that you have the headlines, I can tell you this. The part of the IPCC report that we're talking about right now, it came out in 2021. This is section 6. And we did an episode about it. You can kind of go through and search it all out if you want to. But the interesting thing about this report scientifically was that there were like 5 scenarios that they lay out in this report that tell you like what would happen with what levels of climate mitigation. So like, what would happen if we, were able to cut emissions drastically. What would happen if we were only able to cut them, a little bit in the worst situation? But in the best case scenario here, I think is actually pretty alarming in and of itself. Like in the past, people have often thought, well, like climate change is happening, but we're not really sure at what level. We're not really whatever. There's like questions, I guess. But I think this report is really important because it lays out some really stark numbers demonstrating the ways that like this is actually happening, and we will see the results in our lifetimes. So in the best case scenario that the IPCC report lays out, like this is like the baseline. Like if everyone does everything correctly, if all of these great UN nations harmoniously agree to do something, then that means that the world will at least heat up. The planet will heat up 1.5 degrees centigrade. That will be like a global temperature, like the average global temperature will increase by 1.5 degrees centigrade after 2040, and then it won't get below that unless it won't get below that temperature again to the very end of the century, so like 2100, right? So that means that like no matter, even if we do everything right, even if everything goes exactly to plan, the world will still on average get 1.5 degrees centigrade hotter, which will have massive effects, right? But the important thing here is that like if you do everything correctly, if everyone kind of works together going forward, those effects are not going to be permanent. The damage can be sort of like slowly undone, right? But then there are all these other kind of like scenarios with less climate mitigation where the damage becomes completely off the charts. For example, like the fifth scenario is the worst one, which means like, very little to no climate mitigation, and the global average temperature goes up 4.4 degrees centigrade. And that means like, I don't know, people can't live on Earth anymore. Yeah, we're all in big trouble. Sorry to take that huge diversion, but I guess I want to make sure people know like what the stakes are in all of this. So, but Dean, like what you're saying here is really important because like when it comes to the policymakers, the part that people are going to read, at first there were scientists that were writing like the unlimited growth of capitalism is not sustainable. You can't do that. And then like, those things kind of get taken out in the name of rationality and sort of a lack of political will to maybe do those things or something. But it's pretty bonkers, to say the least.
Yeah. So I think what's really valuable about this editorial, it's not long, so I encourage people to find it and read it. You can read it for free at the Monthly Review website. What's really nice about it is it lays out some of the really specific things that were changed. So it's not just the kind of, I don't know, did you know that it got messed up? But it's like, here's specifically how. So I'm going to read one passage, and then we'll talk about like a few big edits that are maybe relevant among many others. So they say this in the article, the editors. As early as October 2021, the BBC, so not the Monthly Review, not a socialist magazine, but the BBC, relying on documents it had obtained from the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference then taking place, described how various governments were going to war on the scientific consensus. Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Australia, India, Japan, and Norway, together with OPEC, were demanding the removal of parts of the SPM that had insisted on rapid reductions in fossil fuel energy. Australia lobbied against statements in the SPM that indicated that coal-fired plants need to be eliminated while protesting references to fossil fuel lobbyists in the reports. At the same time, most of these countries were seeking to reverse the science in the SPM, pointing to the non-viability of carbon capture and sequestration. Saudi Arabia objected to phrases in the report pointing to the need for accelerated mitigation of climate change. Brazil and Argentina insisted on censoring the scientific report on the subject of decreasing meat-based diets. Switzerland sought to remove sentences in the scientific report pointing to the needs of developing countries to receive financing from rich countries in order to meet the targets of emissions reductions. India, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovakia attacked the consensus for its negative assessment of the role of nuclear power, combating climate change and achieving sustainable development goals. All these countries were successful in cutting out entirely or watering down what they regarded as the objectionable elements in the published version of the SPM. So we'll talk about some more specifics in a minute. But the pattern here, the consistent pattern, right, is each country basically was like, well, how's this going to affect my economy specifically? Yep. and then went through and said, can we erase that part, right? So what you're getting here is really, on the one hand, there is a national interest, a national economic interest at play, but you're also getting the voice of capital, really, right? It's the voice of where the wealth is getting generated in these nations. And that is what is ultimately centering or watering down the scientific report. So in the report for policymakers, you're getting the input of people who already have made policies around protecting their industry rather than around protecting the environment. There's no indication in this editorial, for example, that at any point a government intervened and said the opposite. At no point did someone say, I think maybe we should even do more than this, right? At every stage it was, this sounds like a little bit too much for me specifically.
This is such an interesting artifact. Like the leak itself is such an interesting artifact of the history of technology and science, right? Because when it comes to science, people get very uncritical, I think, in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. I don't know, log on. Well, don't really do this, but you can do it as a thought experiment in your own brain. Log on to reddit.com and go to the atheism subreddit and just look at the way that people talk about science. That's the sort of objective, neutral way to understand the world or something that is completely sort of detached from any ideology. But this is such a great example of the ways that it's not. And I think that, this is not the exception that proves the rule or something, that this is just, I think, how science works in general, right? When it comes to scientific findings, especially when they, come to bear on political things, this is really what happens. Science itself, maybe the scientists are acting in good faith trying to write these things. But all of these kind of pushbacks you get from different governments and stuff, you see the ways that the discourse favors sort of the hegemony of capitalist ideas and sorry, if it's bad for the economy, then we're not going to do it, right? There's a really a good Foucauldian lesson in all of this, I guess, the ways that power dominates discourse, even if it's supposed to be a very neutral and dispassionate sort of thing.
Yeah, it's very funny. So Matt and I are always talking about French philosophy on this podcast, and if you went to graduate school... we're doing a lot of Duolingo as well. If you went to graduate school in the 90s through I don't know, maybe the mid-aughts or something like that, which is what we both did, then you got, I think, fed a pretty steady diet of basically anti-science hermeneutics, right? Not to say kind of anti-vaxxing, anti-masking, all that kind of stuff, but there was a really powerful narrative in continental philosophy, especially in France, that was basically challenging the neutrality of science as a discourse, right? Kind of bemoaning the idea that society is run by experts or run by people who are allegedly following just the value-free path of the sciences, right? And there's all kinds of people in all kinds of ways making that case with different vocabularies. Anybody you read writing in France, I guess, from the 70s on, and then how that gets mitigated into the US and in Canada, they're all very nervous about science.
That's right. We learned it in grad school, but everyone else can log onto Twitter and just look at Neil deGrasse Tyson's page and kind of get the same vibe, I think. You'll suddenly understand that science is not dispassionate.
Yeah, exactly.
Has values.
Yeah, but what's so funny about it, so there's this guy, Bruno Latour, who we've also talked about in this podcast, French philosopher. He is very famous for talking about how science is constructed, and he's a very interesting guy. Problematic in his own way, but interesting. And, so his whole career is basically being listen, you think science is objective truth, but I'm here to tell you that it's a product of social conversations and practices, and some of which are good and bad. So a guy who's kind of destabilizing our faith in science, that was kind of his vibe, his whole thing. And when the pandemic started, he had a very funny interview where he's basically okay, it's not that I was wrong, but probably we don't need that right now. And I feel that way so much reading this article specifically, right? Everything in my academic training is basically designed to be when you hear a scientific report tells you something, you should think twice about it. Not in the sense that it's wrong, but think about what interests are at play underneath, right? But in this case, I'm okay, listen, the scientists said this stuff. And then the governments came along and made these big edits. And then that was kind of peddled as the real science behind it. And what's funny is the monthly review editorial is basically being the science got, messed up with all this other shit or whatever. And it's so funny because all of a sudden I have this kind of Latour moment where I'm like, well, science is always kind of mixed up with this shit, but like, you should listen to the scientists. Like it's very weird to like suddenly have a different reaction or a different impulse. But when it comes to climate change, it is really wild how like the science itself, the scientific community is like explicitly in battle with governments to figure out what to do.
Well, of course, now we're on their side when they agree with us.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, what are the big edits, Dean? What are the big things that got changed in this terrible document?
All right. So there are a bunch of them, but I pulled out just 4 that I thought were relevant to this podcast in particular. So the first is the original draft of the SPM written by scientists. So again, these are scientists suggesting policy making, whatever, summaries. The original draft compared the carbon emissions of the wealthiest 10% of the global population to those of the poorest 10%, indicating that the former account for 10 times the per capita emissions of the latter.
Uh-oh.
The comparison was deleted from the published report.
Stupid.
So pretty wild. I love that some person was just like, let's just not say that.
You just have to. It's just like in a big Google Doc, and someone just. Would you like to accept this change of deleting this entire paragraph?
Yeah, exactly. Number 2, another person or another edit here. The SPM by scientists had indicated that the top 1% accounted for 50% of all aviation-based emissions, while this was dropped from the governmental SPM.
I think this is huge because people on the right, or even people not on the right, people who are just like leery of sort of environmental transformation or whatever, political transformation around environmental issues, will be like, environmental activists, they want you to stop flying altogether. And I think that's true. In a lot of cases, people do say that. But like, if you break it down like this, it's not like, your flight from Chicago to Toronto or whatever. It's like, it's the people who fly constantly on private jets who are accounting for 50% of all of the emissions. It's not you and Coach.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just the top 10% or the top 1%, right? So imagine the top 10%, for example. I would be very curious to see what that percentage would be. And then again, like if you added in, I don't know, like whatever the military is doing to just like test their stupid shit, like that percentage is going to go way up. All right. Another significantly, the science-based SPM explained that over 40% of developing country emissions were due to export production for developed countries. This is no longer included in the final SPM. That is a huge point that I want to return to in a minute. And then the scientific consensus indicated that incremental change was not sufficient to address climate change with its lock-in of high emissions technologies, and that an ambitious transformation with a systemic approach aimed at a fundamental social transition, overcoming vested interests, was required. This was discarded in the governmental consensus. So, like I said, there's lots of other little things you can look at. It's all very interesting and challenging and troubling. But the key here is it's really transparent, right? That what the governments are doing is they're not only even editing it in the interest of their own national economies, right? Of course, Brazil and Argentina don't want people to eat less meat. That makes sense. Agree with it or disagree with it. They're basically looking out for their own economies. The same with whomever, all these like Australia and coal, so on and so forth. But what's really wild, the perverse cherry on top of this horrible cake, is that it's not just their own economies that they're protecting. They're literally protecting the global elite, the global wealth. It is in the interest of capital in the abstract that they're making these edits to the policy document. And I think that is extremely messed up. And something that we should talk about, like the intergovernmental edits on these policies are done in the interest of protecting rich people, and that's it. And I think that is really messed up.
Yeah, it is really messed up because it's not even nationalist, right? It's not even it's not even for the sake of their own country. It's for the sake of the elite, the global elite, whoever those people are.
Yeah.
I mean, we know exactly who they are, but still, global capitalists are behind it. It is deeply messed up, but I think it reflects back on the EPA decision in this whole different light, right? Like, if the EPA is not empowered to make you know, regulations as they were previously, which still were weak-willed, which were reformist, which, you know, weren't they're not the transformation we need, I guess what I'm trying to say. But even if like the EPA can't do that, and like and Congress has to start like if they want to get anything sort of environmentally done regulation wise, who are they going to look to? You know, this document for sure. These are like the global leaders in this conversation, and what they're going to get is like nothing, right? They're going to get policies that support the most wealthy, which I guess is probably what they would do anyways. Um, but you can see this kind of like feedback loop emerge where it's like, okay, we are the leaders of a country. We have to make decisions. We have to make policies. We're also like basically the ruling elite, and then also we have to go look for research that people have done, and like we'll go look at this research, and it's telling us exactly what we want to hear, and isn't that great? And then by 2100, the global temperature will have risen by 4.4%, and we'll all be like roasted. So I don't know. It's just like such a frustrating thing to see happen, because it will hurt a lot of people in the end. Demonstrably so.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing is to get away from that future where it hurts a lot of people in the end, it requires this huge transformation, right? Not even restoring the EPA's ability to limit power plants, but like making the EPA the big war communism juggernaut of like environmental regulation that we need, right? Like that's not even on the table, and that's what the policymakers are saying that we do need is a real transformation in our global systems. I said I wanted to return to that point about 40% of developing country emissions being due to export production for developed countries. I think that is huge. It's something that came up in the discussions around COP26. We did an episode about that last year. So COP26, also another UN thing, the Conference of Parties, it's called. The 26th time that they all gather in a room to talk about climate change and then fail to do anything about it. At that time, one of the big discursive points in the conversation was, okay, yeah, all these Western countries, like, sure, they emit too much, but you know who emits a ton? China or India. Those are the big ones. And how hypocritical of, all these kind of left-wing people to be like upset at the United States when per capita they don't have nearly as many people as other countries like China and India. But the big thing is not even left-wing economists, but just like average, boring economists were all pointing out at that time that even that is bizarre because like China is a gigantic country, India is a gigantic country, and so of course they emit more emissions because they're bigger. They're bigger countries. That's a big thing. But also the industrial kind of or the emission pressure on those economies are primarily due to the function that they have, the role that they have in meeting consumer demand for bullshit in the West, right? Like when you look at like the made in China tags on, I don't know, all the like crappy toys that you buy at the dollar store or whatever, all that stuff is coming from somewhere else, and it takes a lot of emissions to make that stuff. If all the stuff that is consumed by people in developed countries, if that was made in developed countries, the emissions sort of price tag for that would be astronomical. I mean, it would like, it's already awful and embarrassing. It would be that much more. I mean, it would be this like, I mean, it's disturbing now. It would be more disturbing, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So it's really important to make that point because at the end of the day, like there are geopolitical conversations around this, right? Like Joe Biden even says often in his speeches, he's like, Xi Jinping, if he's going to get serious about climate change, like he needs to fix their big emissions problem. But like, that's, I mean, yes, they do, I guess. But like, how are they going to do that when literally their whole economy is based around also trying to be the world's, supply chain headquarters or whatever? Like, that is the system we have, and if we want to change it, we do need that transformational change, not an incremental change, but like a top to bottom global supply chain, global value chain change. And like that is not on the agenda, and these governments have basically decided, they don't want to talk about it.
Right. And I guess what's so frustrating about some of that too, I mean, is the arrogance of Western countries. That sucks. I don't like that. That's very dumb. But also that like so much of the production is completely needless.
Yeah.
Like it's just really frivolous kind of stuff. Like you said, like dollar store toys. I mean, there's all kinds of things that are created in China that are absolutely, I guess, essential, probably. I mean, China creates so many things, right? But there's so much stuff that they create that is, not essential to life, not essential to anyone's life, right? Just that's basically like plastic garbage that will, you know, exacerbate the problem in the end. So it's just it's frustrating to see. I don't know um, so much production outsourced, but like needless production, right?
Mhm.
Production for the sake of production,
Yeah.
and
You know,
I don't know, a bummer.
yeah, this is, I don't know, maybe like my feeling at my most sort of critical theory Adorno phase or whatever is like, I had this like extremely weird intrusive thought, I guess, the other day. I forget what it was, what movie it was, some Disney Pixar movie or something that I saw. And for some reason, I just had this like, like reflex inside where I just thought, how much plastic is now going to be introduced into, the consumer economy just because this movie came out? Like,
Yeah,
all the toys that are made, all the like glossy posters that get made, every single product that's tied up to like a shitty knockoff version of a toy or a t-shirt for like a 6-year-old that's going to wear it once and like whatever parent will throw it in the garbage, like all because of this one movie. Like every time a kids movie comes out, there's, I don't know, like literally hundreds of thousands of lunchboxes made or whatever. And it's like, man, what a messed up dumb economy that we have. It's a bad idea to do this.
Dean, I gotta tell you, sometimes intrusive thoughts are, just irrational things that kind of creep up in your brain, but that one's real scary. So
That's what I'm saying. My
that one's yours old.
my most Adorno.
Yeah.
So and okay, now maybe we can start putting some of the Christian bits on here because it's not just tacked on. Like, I think, what does it mean to reflect on all this stuff as a Christian? In a minute, we can talk about what Leonardo Boff thinks in particular. Right now, we're kind of looking around for other people talking about this, and guess what? Leonardo Boff, you can always go to him. He'll tell you what to think. But I was also thinking Pope Francis has anticipated so much of this stuff already, even in Laudato Si. We've mentioned this on the show in the past too, but he has this really good line in there about how when it comes to fighting climate change, developing countries, which is a bad term, I guess, poorer countries, I guess, to to name what's really going on here. Poorer countries have a hard time fighting climate change for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's hard to develop your economy if you don't industrialize. Maybe it's not impossible, but so far it has proven to be impossible. It's the only path that really we seem to have figured out yet. And guess what? That is very bad for the environment. So they're already held back because if they want to develop their economies further, they're probably going to have to do more emissions to get there. That is complicated. They're also held back because they don't have the capital to even do that. And they also don't have the capital to explore other ways of developing that maybe don't have as many emissions, right? They don't have the capital freedom to invest in clean innovation and so on. And what they do get is handed down from global north economies and usually not at a good price and so on. And so all that to say, what Pope Francis suggests is there does have to be a massive investment of rich countries into poor countries. Sorry, Sweden. You're just gonna have to get over it. But he also says that we really owe, and people in the global north, countries in the global north, owe an ecological debt, is what he calls it, to countries in the global south. And I think that is actually a really fertile kind of way of talking. Like there's a lot there, a lot that's suggestive. And it comes out of that kind of Christian imagination, right? Like we owe something to these other folks. That's not the kind of thing that you're going to get if you think as a policy analyst. It's not the kind of thing that you get as you think of like a person who is editing a report at the UN, right? That's not really the moral formation necessarily that you're coming out of. So I think that's maybe one actual contribution of kind of Christian discourse about ecology that might help us start thinking a little more broadly here, right? Like, what would it mean for us to think about international politics in terms of what we owe our neighbor on the other side of the planet? It's maybe one way of kind of reorienting our mind, even beyond kind of political economy, but in a more sort of spiritual direction that is like actually useful for politics.
Yeah, totally. Let's talk a little bit about what Leonardo Boff has to say about the IPCC report. This is a blog post that he wrote. It's originally in Portuguese, so the translation is probably not quite right, but we'll work with it. It was released about the same time last year that the sixth IPCC report was released, and the title is "Reality Can Be Worse Than We Think." Thanks, Leonardo Boff. I knew that part, but thanks. Okay, so he starts off kind of just like framing the problem, I think, in a way that is I don't know if it's helpful. It's scary. So let's just talk about it. Leonardo Boff says there is talk of a planetary emergency and even an ecological Armageddon that would devastate much of life as we know it. It would be a consequence of the new geological era of the Anthropocene, perhaps of the Necrocene itself. Who cares about this worrying and ominous scenario? Almost nobody. This is the part where I think the grammar breaks down. But he says unconsciousness has lived like in Noah's time, which is he's trying to say that like our time now is just like the time before the flood, right? People are unconscious to the dangers looming. No one knows when or how the flood will come. Everyone is in a business as usual sort of mode, yearning for a return to the old normality, exactly the one that is producing the global tragedy of the coronavirus. So there's some of that going on too. If you can remember back to last year, people were still very concerned about that. People are still very concerned about the coronavirus, but in some different ways. Anyways, even more serious is the realization that there's no collective will either in the heads of state or in the world society to warn of the serious consequences for our lives, for the life of nature, and for the destiny of our civilization. So this framing, I think, is really important because it's just, I don't know, starkly the truth, I guess. Like, literally, if we don't change the way our society functions and produces and supports people, the planet can't, it's just not habitable. In 100 years, you can't live here is kind of what it comes down to. I mean, or whatever. You can live here, but there will be irreversible damage done. And our life will have to change in different ways. So lots of instability in the future. People need to care about this, but surprise, nobody does.
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing that I like the most about Boff, to be honest, is he is one of those rare theologians who's willing to say that outright, that like the people in power do not care about you, and we should say that very loudly. A lot of theologians don't seem to have that kind of will, in my experience.
Yeah, I think so. I'm always really I'm interested though. Like, I feel like sometimes maybe that's overstating it. I like the people in power don't care about you for sure, right? I feel like regular people kind of care. Maybe they don't really understand the the effects of climate change long term or something. But were you to lay it out to them, I think that they would see the danger. But I think that the political will thing is so huge because it just doesn't exist
Right.
for it didn't exist for COVID. It doesn't exist for this. I mean, COVID. Think about how much more direct a threat to people's lives COVID was.
Right.
And there was no political will to solve any problems whatsoever in the United States. We're on the other side of a mass pandemic, and we still don't even have things like sick leave for everybody.
Right.
So, I mean, how much less could politicians care about something that's going to happen in 100 years? It's bonkers. Anyways, Boff goes on to say that he says, those who have overcome this blindness feel the ethical and moral duty to awaken consciences and prepare humanity for the worst. Because of the irresponsibility of the CEOs of large corporations, the inertia of heads of states, and the neglect of society, the various knowledges and movements, with the exception of some, such as Greenpeace, the MST, Greta Thunberg, and others, in raising collective consciousness, we may know a reality worse. We may know a reality worse than we imagine. So here it all is again. There's a handful of people that are out there on the front lines. MST, of course, they're the only ones I really like. That's fine. The rest of them are great. People need to overcome this blindness. I feel like that is true. I don't know how you do it though. It's such a complicated thing to make people care about the future. But
Yeah.
I guess we're doing a podcast for a reason. Maybe people will care. The masses will finally listen to us specifically.
Yeah, listen to us listening to Boff. Yeah, I mean, he does have this kind of way of cultivating that in some ways as by way of a conclusion. I think, well, I'll read it and then maybe we could talk more about it after. So Boff says, two things are urgent with this in mind. The first, to create a deep affective bond with nature and the earth. love them, and take care of them. Second, we need to live in intimate communion with them. Communion is more than a fundamental theological concept. It is a fact of the deepest reality. Everything is in communion with everything because everyone is inter-retro-related. That's a great word. Internalizing this communion, we can feel like brothers and sisters of all things in the style of St. Francis of Assisi, and so we will behave. This behavior is required of us now. He will be able to save life and also save us all affection and communion. So affection and communion are the two things that Boff recommends. And, on a spiritual level, I think that's absolutely true. What I think is really interesting about Boff is if I read any other theologian say that, I'd be so mad. I'd be mad because it would be like, here's all the stuff about how bad climate change is, and then there's this kind of spiritual disposition suggestion at the end. But Boff is great because he actually thinks that, like, if you have that spiritual disposition, it will compel you to act politically, right? And, like, he has a long history of doing that. But you really get, I think, two different kinds of Boffs in his blogging about the ecological crisis. You get this Boff, who's basically, like, ends on a hopeful note, right? A hopeful note that we could, in fact, cultivate these kinds of relationships to the earth, to ourselves, and so on. And we should do that, and we'll be saved. But you also get these other blog posts from Boff elsewhere on the same blog where he's basically like, there's nothing we can do. It's all gonna go to shit, and we deserve it. Like, that's part of it. And that is also because of a failure of our material movements, and it's this kind of like doom kind of picture that, like, if there's any hope, it lies in kind of social movements, really investing in those movements. And I think that's what I like about Boff is it's important to have both of those things, right? Like, like I said, if it was another theologian who ended here, I'd be mad. But because it's Boff, it's like, I can kind of put those two things together. You have to cultivate that spiritual kind of side because literally what else can you do right now? And also you need to, like, find a way to invest in social movements because, like, it really is that bad. Or as he says in the title of this blog post, right? Reality could be worse than we think. So there's something about Boff there that I like, but I don't know. Hard when you see the government literally editing the IPCC report to be like, we're not going to do anything about this.
Yeah, I agree. Were this a different theologian, I would laugh in their face and tweet something mean about them. But Leonardo Boff means something different, I think, than most people. It's true, right? Like, it sounds like almost absurd though to be like, well, okay, how do we defeat the looming threat of climate change? And it's like create a deep, effective relationship with nature. But, like, I guess that means something different though in the context of Boff, which is something to think about. And also to, like, think about how you have a communion with other people too, right? But it's just like, I guess these are the ways that there is a type of, like, spiritual disposition to organizers that can be helpful in light of the most grim situations. But I think that's right though. I don't know, to feel some kind of, like, divine connection to people, like Francis of Assisi or something, is maybe the only way out. Because without that connection, how can you organize all people to do something impossible, right? That's the only way out of this, though, is to confront the political situation with real people power.
People power is where it's at, right? We were just talking about this ecological debt idea in Laudato Si, and the question is, how do you collect it? Who's the debt collector, right? And I don't know, maybe a bad metaphor, but I guess the point I'm making is, like, without some kind of people power, some kind of real pressure in whatever form that takes, whether it's being in the streets, pressuring elected officials, doing something like the MST does, where they literally occupy land in Brazil and don't let other people have it, don't let capitalists have it. All that kind of stuff is part of it, right? Like, I think there's not a lot of hope outside of people power, and the question is, how do you get it? And there is that kind of spiritual side to it. I don't know. For me, I think that's all I can really think of to be hopeful anymore, honestly, is, like, somewhere in Brazil right now, somebody is, like, planning to, squat on land that a developer wants to destroy in the Amazon or something. And they're doing that because they care about the poor and the planet. And, like, somewhere in Canada also, like in Wet'suwet'en territory, they're doing that, right? Opposing the Coastal GasLink pipeline or whatever, right? Like, people are out there building people power, and there are people building solidarity around those kinds of actions. I think that's where it's at. But yeah, I don't know. Like I said, the IPCC report is literally being edited so that governments are saying we're not going to do anything about this. So like, I don't know. We have to figure out how to make them one way or another.
Yeah, it's true. And it's like, I guess the choice that you have is like, you can either start doing it now and figure out ways to take take scenario number 1 of the IPCC report where the damage is reversible, or you can wait until things become like unstabilized because life is so like hellish. You can organize then too, I guess, but like I'd rather do it now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I that's the other piece of it too, though, is like, what's the line in Walter Benjamin that like the past has a claim on us, right? Like there's a kind of like historical struggle of ancestors that kind of leads to where we are. And I think that's also true in the opposite direction, right? The future also has a claim on us right now. Like people always talk about like think of the children or whatever. I don't really like that framing for a lot of different reasons. But I think it's true that like, I don't know, like in the year 2100, when I'm probably not going to be present on this planet anymore, like people will be dealing with whatever that reality is. And like, they'll be asking legitimate questions about like, why didn't you do anything about this? And at the very least, I want to be like, well, I tried very hard. I tried my very best with like whatever was available to me at that time. And like, I'm sorry, it wasn't good enough, but I would not want to sort of live a life that was like, I don't know, I didn't figure it out. I didn't go to a meeting because it was awkward. I didn't like call somebody or whatever because I didn't feel like talking on the phone, like all that kind of stuff. Like I didn't do the boring work of organizing of like emailing 30 people and telling them that the rally is tomorrow, like all that kind of stuff. And I think that's the question. Like, how do we build the skills we need now for the sake of people in the future? And maybe that's where I'm finding hope at the very end, right? Like, there are things that we can do now. We don't have to sit around and like complain about the IPCC until everybody sort of burns up. We can try something at the very least and prepare for the worst.
That's a great pep talk from Coach Dean. We're all circled up here in the locker room at the end of the world, and we're hearing what we need to hear to do something about it.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. We're on social media. We've got a Twitter. You can find us there. I don't know what else to say about it. You can enjoy the music on this podcast in our next episode next week, which will also be by The Illogical Spoon and Amori Armstrong, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have